As repression has evolved, so too has the use of tech by civic movements. Despite challenges, online organizers are deploying creative strategies to not only adapt, but leapfrog and finding new ways to stay safe and iterating along the way. We now turn to DFR Lab non-resident fellow, Sarah Oh, who will lead a discussion on the evolution of digital citizen movements in Asia.
Thanks, Graham. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion. As Graham mentioned, we'll be talking about movements in Asia and the role of the internet in those movements. I'm Sarah Oh, a non-resident fellow at the DFR Lab, and I'd love to introduce the panel briefly before we jump in. We have three great guests with us to explore this topic. So first we have Lei Win, a freelance journalist reporting on Myanmar, food security, and climate change. She runs a newsletter, Thin Ink, and was previously with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thin was born and raised in Myanmar, which is relevant for this discussion, and is the founder of a very important news organization, Myanmar Now. If you haven't seen Myanmar Now yet, it's an outlet that's been providing really courageous coverage of what's been happening in Myanmar since the February coup in the country. Thanks for being here, Thin. Next, I'd like to welcome Glacier Kwong, a research fellow at the Hong Kong Democratic Council. Glacier is known by many as Hong Kong's most famous online fighter for democracy. Glacier is known for uploading a video calling for international support during the Umbrella Revolution. Some of you may have seen this, it went viral. Glacier is now a doctoral student at the University of Hamburg, where she's researching data protection and surveillance in Hong Kong and China. She's a regular contributor to the German newspaper Welt am Sonntag and Apple Daily in Hong Kong, which we all just learned issued its final edition today, something, Glacier, that I hope that you'll be able to comment on during this session. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we have Tim McLaughlin, a contributing writer for The Atlantic, based in Hong Kong, so it's quite late for you, Tim, we know. His writing focuses on political and societal changes taking place in the country. Tim has also written about social media platforms and geopolitical issues for outlets like Wired and the Washington Post. You might recognize his byline from that work. And we're so glad that you were able to join us. Thank you. So Tim, Glacier, and Thin, I've had the chance to briefly connect with you and follow your reporting over the last few months. I'm so fascinated, I think this is where I want to start, by just how quickly the switches have flipped in Hong Kong and Myanmar, at least from an international vantage point. Specifically, the quick succession of new chokeholds online. We're seeing more sites being blocked and filtered, more people and content disappearing online. In the case of Apple Daily and many activists in Myanmar, literally going dark. So I wanted to spend the first part of this discussion really focusing on the intersections in your work across the two countries. And I think one recurring theme is really how you've all been able to put these new repressive shifts into context. That's really important for understanding where we are and the changes that we're seeing. So Glacier, I'd like to start with you. You've been tracking how people have been able to organize online, first as part of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, and now in exile in Germany. Can you comment on how the online strategies of the movement are adapting across that long arc to more repression online?
Thank you, Sarah. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege for me to speak to all of you about Hong Kong and everything that I've seen in the online world. In comparison, when we first looked at the movement in 2014, which is the Umbrella Revolution that Sarah just spoke of, it is actually very different from what we see in 2019 because people adopt a much more carefree attitude towards online communication. We were using WhatsApp or Telegram or even Facebook messages to organize ourselves, and it's more of a top-down organization that will be major organizers of the movement that are saying, oh, we are gonna have a protest or have some sort of actions that are going to take place like around the government headquarters, and people would pass that message around online, on Facebook, on other social media, and then people will show up at the protest place. But when we see what happened in 2019, that is a very different attitude towards online communication. People are generally more careful when it comes to communication with one another. We stop using Telegram or Facebook messages, or we stop talking about if I am going to attend a protest online, because we know that that is risky, and because peaceful protest has been made a crime in Hong Kong since 2019. So it's very difficult to talk about one's personal encounter with some sort of social movement. So people switch to platforms like Signal, using Proton Mail to communicate. And because as Nathan has talked about, the movement, it is actually a leaderless movement. That is, people would discuss among themselves about what to do. There's no leader to tell them what to do. There are only facilitators. There will always be someone who is putting people together, talking about how things should be done, but it is always up to the crowd to decide if they want to do it. So it becomes very tricky because it is very difficult to know who is online, like who is who online, because you never know who exactly that person is. So we have developed a very, very weird model of talking about how should we do things. For example, as Nathan said, when people meet each other on an online forum, then we will start a Telegram group that allows everyone to join, but we are very aware of that. We should not share our real names. We should not share any personal details. We're just there to get the job done. And afterwards, this group would disband themselves, or they would like get to know each other and trust each other, and then they would maybe migrate to Signal so that they can really discuss things, discuss political ideas, and they are not afraid of letting others know who they are. But this is really fascinating to see how trust is being built and how trust was destroyed throughout 2014 to 2019 at the same time. So this is the differences that I actually see, that there's a very strong shift of the mindset that is from very carefree, privacy carefree, to very privacy aware, that we know that we are being threatened. That's why we're going to adopt like sophisticated measures in terms of privacy and anonymity.
That's it. Tim, I'm curious if you want to weigh in from where you sit, what you're seeing in terms of that threat that Glacier mentioned. Are you seeing any patterns or influences that might impact how people maneuver online?
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for having me to begin with. And then, yeah, I mean, I think what we have, what's happening in Hong Kong, what Glacier said, you know, I think is totally spot on. I was at the Apple store the other day getting my phone fixed, and the guy working there remarked to me that he's gotten really good at making sure people's VPNs connect, because so many people have installed them in the past year in Hong Kong. That it's become a common issue of people coming in saying, oh, my phone won't work, when it turns out their VPN is just a little jittery. So, you know, that's a small anecdote, but I think that kind of speaks to the mindset that a lot of people have. And in terms of, you know, what we're seeing, you know, she talked about, I guess, Glacier talked a little bit about, you know, the methods that people are using. I'll talk a little bit about the other side, which is from the government and the authorities. And I think what we're seeing in Hong Kong that is interesting or troubling, depending on how you look at things, is kind of a marriage of new and old. You know, we have a new national security law that hasn't been around for even a year yet. And you see some people obviously being, you know, facing super serious charges kind of under that. But then at the same time, you see the government reaching really far back in the law books here, using sedition laws that have been around, you know, since way back in the colonial eras, and charging some people that were involved in administering Telegram groups during the protests and things like that. Obviously, when the sedition laws were written back in the 1800s or early 1900s, you know, Telegram didn't exist. So we have kind of an interesting set of tools that the government and the authorities here are using to go after people who are, you know, politically active, lawmakers, activists. And so I think we see kind of a dual threat in this kind of new NSL law that we don't really know much about. The first case just started this week, and we're not really sure how that will proceed. Flip side, you know, this use of pulling out these really, really old laws to crack down on the use of new technology.
I'm shifting slightly to Myanmar, reflecting on what Tim and Glacier just said. Finn, I'm curious if you would be willing to share your perspective, which you know, as a personal perspective, you grew up in Myanmar when there was no internet. and then it suddenly had explosive amounts of internet. And then it's, been pulled away again, and you've been doing a lot of reporting trying to understand what's happening now on the ground. Can you comment on the constriction that you've seen?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah, for having me as well. If we could just, go back a little bit, perhaps, a few decades. So I grew up in the 1980s in Myanmar, where we really only had landlines. So in 1988, we had nationwide protests as well, led by students. At that time, people were really fearful that, the phone lines would be tapped. And I remember being told that, we have to be very careful of what we say on the phones. And of course, the protesters also didn't have mobile phones or social media to coordinate their movements or even keep the outside world informed. That was the same case even for the 2007, the Saffron Revolution as well. And then slowly, internet and mobile phone connections appeared, but they were limited to very, very, a small amount of people because SIM cards were atrociously expensive. I mean, we're talking about, people having to pay, for example, like $2,500 for a SIM card, But internet cafes then proliferated in the 2000s, and people started using them, starting mainly to play games, but then also to sort of connect with the outside world. But the concerns and the fears, about how secure these things are were still there. So when I, for example, went back home to report undercover for Reuters and the Thomson Reuters Foundation in the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis in 2008, I set up email accounts on Yahoo and Gmail with fake names, because I needed to send story backs, and I needed to do that from internet cafes or from the lobby of the Traders Hotel, which I think is now called Sisuli Shangri-La, which was one of the few places where you could actually get reliable internet. And I set up 2 accounts because the authorities would periodically block Yahoo or Gmail, but never both at the same time. And then things just opened up dramatically, in 2011, and overnight the cost of SIM cards dropped from a few hundreds to $1.50. And we leapfrogged all the way to smartphones, and suddenly Myanmar was online. And I noticed that, some of the fear around surveillance and security sort of disappeared because people were just so excited about being able to connect with pretty much anyone in the world. For example, I remember writing a story about how activists rely so much on Viber to communicate with each other about their movements and what they're doing, even though it wasn't very secure. But, that wasn't at the top of their concerns at that point. Of course, this opening a decade ago led to this generation of tech-savvy people back in Myanmar who are now helping us stay informed about what's happening back home compared to the previous, protests. And they're also able to link up with the other protests in the region, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, the whole Milk Tea Alliance. But that opening has also sort of led people to become sort of perhaps very comfortable with sharing information online, which is not ideal from a security point of view. For example, things like sharing their mobile numbers, as well as the locations of where they are, and like Tim was just now talking about how these laws are being used in Hong Kong to, prosecute people. In Myanmar, they're using this, a new section 505A under the penal code to charge people with spreading misinformation, and when they are sort of charging people, or when they are sort of like publishing these people are breaching this code, they're linking it to people's Facebook profiles, which essentially means this is how they are tracking. They're definitely tracking what people are saying online, and then use to weaponize that to charge people. Of course, we now know that military junta has shut the whole internet, the doors again, because one of the first things they did after staging the coup was to shut down the internet. They also cut off mobile data and Wi-Fi for months. Social media sites were blocked. Now, some connectivity has been restored, but very limited. They're trying to do this internet with whitelisting apps. So now suddenly everybody is using VPNs as well to circumvent it, and people are having to learn, sometimes in a really hard way, how to stay safe in using some of these digital tools. They're having to sort of relearn some of these issues around security again. And unfortunately, Myanmar has pretty much gone back to where it was more than a decade ago.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I said new repression, but this longer time horizon that you've observed, Finn and Glacier too, really make it seem like it's not new, right? It's part of it's an extension of a much longer continuum, and these strategies have not developed overnight. So I like your new old framing, Tim. I'm going to start using that. I'm curious about this adaptation. That's something else that keeps coming up. You've all been following people who haven't given up easily on communicating and sharing information despite the challenges, whether it's in the diaspora or within, as you mentioned, people online who, despite internet blockages and email blocks that we can't comprehend, are still innovating to organize and get their messages out. How are you, and Finn, maybe we'll start with you to pick up this thread. How are people in Myanmar keeping the democratic spirit alive despite all these odds?
I think, one of the biggest shows of resistance, or like you said, keeping the democratic spirit alive, that I have seen so far is from just ordinary citizens who've become the eyes and ears of career journalists who are hiding or having to leave the country. Some have received training on how to sort of do reporting and record, images and videos, but many others have not. And they're just ordinary citizens, and in many cases, knowingly taking calculated risks to still use channels that are not secure or encrypted to sort of relay news to journalists, to keep everyone informed about what's happening. Because sure, encrypted apps and VPNs, they're great, but they require certain bandwidth, and some of that is just not available in many places in Myanmar. So, people are using these digital tools to keep everyone, people like myself including, informed what's happening. They're also using digital tools to collect evidence on abuses that the junta is committing. For example, the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar is actually, asking people to sort of use encrypted methods of communication to contact them, to share evidence of crime against humanity. There are also obviously offline efforts. There are new political journals that are now being printed and distributed by hand. I guess the last point I would like to point out is the fact that, the creativity of the people in Myanmar, particularly the youth, have remained undimmed despite this online repression. Many are still finding ways to share information, and many are expressing their opposition through digital art. And to anyone listening and watching, I would really like to recommend people to check out that artwork that's available on Raise Three Fingers website as an example of how people are still keeping that spirit alive.
Thank you. People, despite how different Hong Kong and Myanmar are, people like to draw parallels between what the environment you're talking about, Finn, and Glacier. I think what has been your experience of the constant trade-off between safety and exposure, right? Do I stay safe or do I reach an audience? And that can dictate everything from what platform people are using to when they come up for air online and share information. I'm curious if you've engaged much with colleagues from other countries. You've mentioned the Milk Tea Alliance. Are you seeing the online netizen movement translate into more sustained collaboration, coordination, learning, engagement to figure out how to survive in this this environment where you're constantly evaluating what the next move is and how to stay safe?
I think I do see a lot of parallels in a way. I know that these movements cannot be compared, like the movement in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Taiwan, or in other places are fundamentally very different from that of Hong Kong. But I do see some certain parallels that maybe the regime used similar tactics or the people uses similar tactics to fight back. For example, recently, Hong Kong websites has begun to be blocked by local internet service providers. A website that Nathan and I was part of, it's called the Hong Kong Charter 2021. It is a charter that we wrote in order to kind of try to organize the diaspora communities that are abroad outside of Hong Kong. And at the first instance, the police actually wrote a letter to Wix, an Israeli company that is outside of Hong Kong, and asked them to take down our website because it is illegal under national security law.
This is Wix, the website building company, right?
Yes, yes, yes. And then we were being taken down offline for a few days, and Nathan have written emails to them asking for why. And then we got this letter from the Hong Kong police, and we decided to make it public and making a loud fuss about it on social media. And then 3 hours later, Wix put it back up and claimed that it was a mistake. But then later, we found our websites being blocked by local internet service providers in Hong Kong, that the website is no longer accessible from Hong Kong. So I do see this kind of like site blocking kind of resembles what I see in other places, especially in Myanmar when their internet is completely shut down. And like, of course, because all of these movements are ongoing, there are not a lot of insights into what's going to work 100% and what's not going to work, because we're still in that trial and error process. Everyone everywhere is trying to figure out what might work, like handing out pamphlets like physically, or like trying to teach people to defend themselves digitally. These are the things that we're trying to do, but we're not sure if it's gonna 100% work. So there are other things that we, like Hong Kongers or my colleagues would go for. We were looking into like past movements like those in Cuba, in Tibet, or in China. How do they organize the diaspora community after a lot of their activists or organizers have fled the country or fled the place? How do they organize themselves? How do we learn from the lessons and not repeat some of the mistakes that they have made? So we are organizing book clubs. We're constantly exchanging our ideas with different leaders of other movements and trying to learn from them. And another thing that I feel very important to share here is how moments of solidarity with other movements have moved me. I was in another panel a few months ago, and there is a Myanmar girl who was trying to ask a question, and she was actually asking the question very quickly, because she said, oh, the internet is going to be turned off in 10 minutes, so I only have 10 minutes to ask you my question, and hopefully I can hear you answer. So I was actually very moved by the moment that she's putting it quite casually, but I can feel all of the tension behind. And she said she was very supportive of the Hong Kong movement, and she wishes us all the best, but she is also in the same or even worse situation that Hong Kongers are facing. And I was very moved by her courage and all of the things that she got to share. And I kind of feel like we can all connect to each other because of the things that we've gone through, no matter it is the digital oppression that we're facing or the actual oppression that we are facing. And this is how we can all work together, even though the Milk Tea Alliance is kind of a loose connection between these movements, but we are trying to establish like genuine connections and genuine sympathy and solidarity like within ourselves. And I do feel like, as Thin have suggested, there are trade-offs when we're thinking about using technology, especially the regime always like has the upper hand because they have all the money, they have all the authority, and they have all the resources. And I feel like it is a dilemma that the Hong Kong movement faces as well, whether to choose safety or engagement with the public, because as someone overseas, like it would be very beneficial for me to be able to engage with the audience, but by publicly doing that, I'm actually putting more people at risk. Or for people to contact me or to raise out concerns online, they're making themselves an easy target. But the thing about political movement or political act is to be visible, or else it's not gonna act like a social movement. So it's a very huge dilemma we're facing. Usually, like, because I can only decide for myself and I cannot like act in other people's roles. So I would always suggest it's better to be safe than sorry, even though you cannot engage with a lot of people, but at least you are safe. So there are more rooms and possibility that you can do other things in the future. But for myself, I often feel like, is it the right time for me to go further? Should I push a bit forward? And even though it might put myself at risk or it might hinder like my personal safety and so on. But this is something that we are all facing, and it would be great if there are like solutions to that, even though I don't feel like there is a solution to that under the circumstances that we are all facing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. Tim, what Glacier shared about Wix is, makes me think something like that must have an impact on communities who are trying to get the word out, whether they're abroad or in the country. We were talking about people in Hong Kong earlier, but now thinking about it more on a global stage, what's the impact of something like that? I'm guessing it has to impact the communities that are important for your reporting, right? When they're seeing more obstacles like that in them sharing their feelings on an issue or trying to communicate with you. Can you comment on that? And are you seeing a shift in how people are engaging with you and other international journalists?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a few things going on. I think that the Wix, situation, obviously, the kind of global reach of the national security law was something that, legal scholars and people had pointed out when it was first, unveiled, I guess, about a year ago. But in terms of kind of what that meant in terms of global implications, I think we were all kind of waiting to see, some people saying, oh, it'll just hang there. It's a bit of a threat and stuff. With the Wix situation, and perhaps there's other situations that we're unaware of, right? There's a lot of the enforcement of this is shrouded in quite a bit of secrecy. And so I think, the Wix situation, I think was kind of the first, public moment where I think people saw, the reach here and saw kind of the seriousness that the Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong police had, in going after these people. And perhaps it shouldn't have come, as a surprise. If you look back, the comments that the security secretary here made, John Lee, has made repeatedly that people like Nathan and other people are that the government will continue to pursue them, forever, essentially, and no matter where they are. And so those threats, I think, turned out, to not be totally empty yet. And I think the Wix situation kind of woke people up to that bit of the law that was certainly looked at by scholars and flagged, but we didn't really see any kind of like tangible implications. And then the other thing I think with on the Hong Kong front, I think that we're talking about comparisons between movements here. And I'll pivot off that a little bit. I think what we hear a lot and see a lot is as a narrative or talking points about, the Great Firewall coming to Hong Kong, the Chinese style firewall and stuff. And I think that can be a little bit perhaps like unhelpful. Maybe Glacier agrees or disagrees, but I think it can be a slightly unhelpful because I think it makes what's happening here and stuff like trivializes a little bit. People think, well, it's it's still not totally cut off, it's not walled off and stuff. Where these kind of incremental changes, they should make people stick their heads up and be alarmed or concerned or take notice of what's happening, right? Just because it's not the situation that's in mainland China, because it hasn't gotten totally cut off, and we're not, I can still talk to you guys, or we still use Twitter freely and stuff like that. Just because that has happened, just because this Great Firewall hasn't arrived, doesn't mean we shouldn't be paying attention. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be, concerned about some stuff that's going on. So I think that's one of the comparisons that misses the point here. Is you have something that's so drastic. China's been able to do something with the internet that no one else has been able to accomplish, and kind of applying that to other places is unhelpful. Like I said, I think it kind of trivializes, some of the issues that we're seeing, and certainly some of the issues. In Myanmar as well, where the ways of shutting down the internet and keeping people offline are quite quite crude, but also fairly effective, right? Just kind of like cutting cords and things like that. You don't need massive sophistication to pull this off in the way that it's been done in some places.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll just jump in and add like a little bit. I think I actually agree with what Tim said, and I think this is exactly the results Beijing and the Hong Kong government wants. Like they want people to think about like, oh, things are not that bad in Hong Kong. They can still use Facebook. They can still use Twitter. And that would like somehow sustain the facade of one country, two systems still kind of exist in Hong Kong, given the national security law. And I think this is something foreign media and foreign companies in Hong Kong should be very aware of. It's like what Tim just said.
Thanks for jumping in on that. What do you guys see? A question for all of you. I think everyone who's waking up to this space and then now beginning to understand how nuanced these challenges are, as you've all pointed out, really want to understand what's the big debate coming, what's the biggest challenge coming, where do you feel like businesses, governments, NGOs are perhaps not paying enough attention, especially if they want to live up to values focused on free expression and ensuring the internet helps rather than represses civic dialogue. Do you guys care to comment on that? Maybe Finn, we'll start with you on Myanmar and then go to Tim and Glacier.
Sure. I guess, I guess my point, particularly to the international community, would be to make sure that they're not party to the junta's repression of the people in Myanmar, whether we're talking about online or offline, because at the moment the international community is failing the people of Myanmar, and I'm sure they are failing the people of Hong Kong as well. And I'm saying this based on an investigation that we recently did. We meaning a group of journalists in Europe. It was led by Lighthouse Reports, which is a Netherlands-based news organization that sort of specializes in bringing reporters from different outlets together to sort of do deep dives on particular issues. And this time we looked at surveillance technology that Myanmar military now has access to. And in fact, Tim has written fairly extensively on some of these deals and some of the dodgy, companies that were involved before. So this investigation that we did was based on these hundreds of leaked government budgets from two ministries, Ministry of Home Affairs and a Ministry of Transport and Communications, from between the years 2018 and 2021. We also looked at other data leaks and open source material. And what we discovered was that there are about 40 Western companies whose products that the government was trying to buy. And we're talking about tools that could monitor Wi-Fi, crack passwords, extract data from phones, recover deleted files, etc., etc. And these companies come from Sweden, Canada, the United States, and Italy, just to name a few. Now, it was hard to know exactly, how many were actually sold to the government, but we know that some definitely made it to Myanmar. We discovered tender documents and who won these tender documents, and of course, now the junta has access to them, and the companies, their defense was that, they were only, selling such stuff during the civilian government's rule from about 2016 until the coup in February. But the thing is, a quick search on Google would have told them that the military in Myanmar still held many levers of the government, including, some key ministries, which includes the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the military's abuses, which date back decades, have been well documented. And all of this shows is that, Myanmar has been building a vast arsenal of technology that could be used for internal digital repression, and many of them come from the West. And in fact, I believe some of these tools are already in use. I'll just give you three short examples. So last week, Al Jazeera English released a documentary which touched on some of these issues, and as part of this collaborative effort we've had with Lighthouse Reports. In there, the daughter of a high-profile activist who was arrested on the day of the coup on the 1st of February, so he's now being charged based on an email that she said was definitely deleted from his mobile phone. I've also been told of at least one recent case where arrest was made based on intercepted calls. And just this week, Myanmar Now, which is the investigative news agency that you mentioned, which is set up but is now run by a completely different team, they reported on how a pregnant woman miscarried after she was beaten because the authorities found a picture of her at a protest on her mobile phone. Now, apparently, the junta used a machine to recover deleted photos, and that was how this picture was found. So, the international community just needs to do so much more to make sure these technologies do not fall into the hands of the Myanmar military. Sure, people will say, China and Russia will provide it. That's, I think, a completely different discussion. The West needs to do its part, and at the moment, they're not.
Sobering. Glacier, is there anything that you want to add on international challenges, opportunities?
I think another thing other than, like, as Finn have suggested, which I completely agree, is like the West should stop providing these kind of like tools that like dual use goods that will be used directly and indirectly in human rights violation. These should be completely banned, and there are laws and regulations that should be enhanced so that these things don't happen again. And other thing that I want to mention is the role that big companies play. For example, after the UN have actually suggested people in Myanmar to use Proton VPN or Proton mail services, Apple actually blocked like Proton's update. and making it even more difficult for people to have access to tools like that. And in China, people cannot access foreign media, people cannot access VPN or secure like communication tools, because under Chinese law, Apple has to block them all. And this is just outrageous, because like Apple users in the US have access to everything. But why, like, it's human rights to have like private communications and to the right to like data protection and privacy. But those users in China cannot do that. And it is possible for Hong Kongers not to have access to VPNs or these tools under national security law, because the government now has the authority to do that. And this is something that we should all be aware of, like the roles that big companies play. Of course, they have all kinds of excuses saying, oh, we have to comply by the local laws to stay in the market, but that is completely beside the point. No, if the law is unjust, or if the law of if your operation involves direct and indirect human rights violation, that this is not acceptable, especially when all of these companies brand themselves as like defenders of the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression, and this should not be happening. And I think there has been like some efforts from the European level to try to improve the situation. For example, they're now pushing for the Digital Marketing Act in European Union. That is, it will address the monopoly status of the Apple or the Google App Store, so that they have to open up their App Store or these kind of services that are no longer closed end, so that more services can be provided and they cannot block this kind of updates in the European Union. That it might affect people in Myanmar and Hong Kong as well. And this is a welcome act. And other countries should have done the same, like following these kind of footsteps to, like, it's on one hand an antitrust issue, but on the other hand, it's also a human rights issue. And I think, like, for people in the West, I think it is very important that the consumers stand up. Like, for example, Apple finally adopted their very first human rights policy after a lot of pressure coming from the consumers, even though it's not like practically very helpful, but it is a good start. And it shows that consumers actually have the role to play here. If you are someone in the West or in the free world that believes in freedom of speech should be universal, because it is, then you have a lot of role to play. Urge the services or the products that the company producer that you are using to actually be responsible of human rights, so that they can like really brand themselves as human rights defenders, because they're actually defending human rights in that case.
Mm-hmm. Glacier, that's something that when you go to discussions and forums about internet freedom and human rights, it's that same refrain that keeps coming up, right? You need to live up to these values. But can we go a little bit further on that? Like, what should we all be coalescing around? What do you want to see both people who are listening in, who probably represent policy, business, and NGOs? Like, is there a common thing that we should all be thinking about in the 5-10 year horizon and be advocating for? How do we get there?
Yes, I would say it's a huge idea to throw in here, because it's not going to happen overnight. But like data minimization, like better data collection practices is going to help. For example, I know that Facebook is turning down like around 200 data requests from the government, because they said that they're not going to take data requests from authorities under national security law. But what if Facebook, Google, or Apple, all of these big tech companies never have any data to actually turn in, like ProtonMail, Signal do, because they do not collect any data that is actually meaningful, and so that they have nothing to provide to the authorities, no matter it's in Hong Kong, it's in Myanmar, or in Thailand. This would be the ideal world for everyone. I know that it's very difficult, because we all know that their business models are being driven by data. It means that we are forcing them into changing their business model completely. But if we are always talking about the threats of commercial and governmental surveillance right now, and I think data minimization, it's the only solution that I see in the horizon right now. And I'm not saying that no data should be collected, but I don't think a huge amount of data that can reveal who you are completely should be collected. And this is something we should look into. And another idea that I have is universal data protection principles. It has been discussed like over the past years, and I don't think it's coming to be effective very soon, because the European Union, the US, simply these two things have very different approach when it comes to data protection. But if we can start talking about universal data principles, it might help these cross-border multinational companies to think about how they should treat personal data and how can they protect their users instead of simply selling their users as their products.
Thank you. We're just about at time. We could talk. I could talk another hour about these issues with you three. Tim, since given that you're on the ground, I wonder if could you take a minute just to reflect on anything that you think people are really missing right now in the coverage, conversation, the talking points about what's happening on the ground in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not just Hong Kong, but I'll speak to Myanmar a little bit as well, and kind of try to build on what these two said here. And I think that we have this conversation sometimes about what we just talked about using platforms, social media, and stuff like that. And sometimes I see commentators online or people on social media saying, well, you should just quit Facebook, or you should just quit WhatsApp, or you should just quit Telegram, right? And I think that's a hugely problematic statement that comes from a position of like extreme privilege when it comes to internet usage and freedoms and things like that. People in Myanmar don't have the opportunity to just quit Facebook, because it is very much like where, I mean, certainly, of course they do, but it would cut them off from a huge amount of their life and a huge amount of the people that they're in touch with and a huge amount of information flow. And people that can't just, quit Telegram or quit something in Hong Kong because you lose connections with your family and your friends and things like that, right? And I think that's really offloading the burden of the problems that we see, of what we talked about, of sort of, companies abiding by onerous local regulation, things like that, kind of bending to companies bending to crazy demands from governments. That's offloading those issues on the user and saying, this is your problem, when it's not. And so I think there needs to be, probably a more robust discussion, on those topics, right? I think this local law part that Glacier touched on as well, is something obviously that we're seeing now play out in Hong Kong, as I mentioned earlier, right? When you have this global law, right? Where do the limits of that end with tech companies? Where does it stop? Where are the borders? Are there any borders, right? So I think that part of it's super important. So yeah, I mean, I think that discussion just needs to kind of, I think sometimes just gets watered down or diluted down to this. Well, you should just log off, just quit, just delete your account, which is really just a fairly kind of zero sum, not very productive way of discussing the issues. And like I said, is rooted in a position of tremendous, tremendous kind of privilege and internet freedom that a lot of people don't have.
That's great. I think that's a great place to end on the need to really understand the context in which these platforms and tools and products are being used. Thank you so much for joining. I know there were questions from the audience. You can follow Finn and Tim's reporting online, follow them on Twitter. Glacier, I know you also do a lot of research and writing and advocacy online, so please find them, follow the voices that they amplify through their work. And I think it's clear to all of us from this discussion that what's happening in not just Myanmar and Hong Kong, but the entire region in Asia is so critical for any conversation on democracy, technology, online activism, and that perhaps there's a lot more that we need to unpack with the nuance that you call out, Tim, in order to figure out what sort of collaborations, coordinations, and discussions need to start happening now. So with that, thank you very much for joining us from 3 different time zones and many more, I'm sure, with the audience that tuned in. And I will now turn it back to the DFR crew.